In Three Houses, the Tragedy of Duscur in 1176, 4 years before the start of the game, was a major historical event that involved a handful of Western Kingdom nobles conspiring against Dimitri's father, the late King Lambert. It was a horrific moment in the kingdom's history, an elaborate plan concocted by Thales of Those Who Slither in the Dark and performed by Western Kingdom nobles, which saw not just Lambert murdered in Duscur, but Glenfraldarius, Felix's brother and Ingrid's fiancé, literally all kingdom knights, and finally it left the fate of Lambert's wife, Patricia, up in the air, as she went missing immediately afterwards. Dimitri was the sole survivor, miraculously avoiding the fate of his peers and family thanks to Gustav Dominic. From then on, Dimitri swore vengeance against those responsible. It also permanently damaged his psyche. The voices and screams of the victims, his father and friend included, constantly reach out to him to avenge them. Three Houses' Azure Moon, Dimitri's route, leaves a lot of question he, and the viewer by extension, have up in the air. The closest he ever comes to discovering who was responsible in-game was when he was able to confront Lord Arundel, one of his prime suspects already, but he basically just insults him about his family and gives him a non-answer when pressed about Patricia's role in the tragedy. He also briefly interrogates Cornelia, who tells him about Patricia's involvement but as a clear final act of spite. Funnily enough, he actually learns the most with his ace support with Happy and their paired ending, when literally they discover where the Slitherers are and eradicate them. So much was left unresolved for Dimitri and the player, and there were a ton of questions never answered, like which Western nobles were responsible? Why did the Western nobles conspire against Lambert? Who specifically killed Lambert? Was Dimitri meant to survive? What role did Cornelia play here? Why did Thales want this to happen? What happened to Lady Patricia after the event? Is she still alive? And did the Empire play a role in the tragedy beyond just the Slitherers? It was frustrating to say the least trying to piece together this massive moment in Fodlan's history, only to be left to speculate and theorize on virtually every single one of these questions. And for some of them, like who specifically killed Lambert or whether the Empire played a role, we can only get so far. The former, we only know that it wasn't someone from Duscur, and the latter, while the original Cornelia and Arundel were both from the Empire, their body snatchers during the tragedy itself were Agarthan. But was anyone else involved that were not from Dubstep City? For a few years, we were just left to concede that nothing would be answered anymore. The game was done. And maybe if Cornelia or Thales got into Fae, maybe they would lore drop something, but no. However, much later, Three Hopes would be announced, rekindling Three Houses loreheads and Dimitri fans alike. Perhaps this game would provide the answers we sought for so long. And provide it did. The demo of Three Hopes dropped an ass ton of lore about the tragedy, debunked fan theories about it, and unveiled even more suspects behind the tragedy. And the full game, of course, helped resolve even more questions. Through documents spread around the base camps and dialogue exchanges in this Warriors spin-off, we can finally piece together more about it. This video attempts to bring it all together and discusses what is still left unknown. That being said, a disclaimer. This game is still new and there are possibly minor conversations with NPCs that we have missed by accident in our research for this video. So if there ends up being a detail we missed, let us know. We aren't perfect researchers and aren't exactly working with a fully transcribed game as of this very moment, but we did do our best. Let's tackle 4 questions first. Which Western nobles were responsible? Why did the Western nobles conspire against Lambert? Who specifically killed him? And was Dimitri meant to survive? To start, let's begin with the first 4 chapters of Azure Gleam and talk about the antagonist of this arc before the 2-year time skip, Rufus. Duke Rufus is Dimitri's uncle and the kingdom's regent who was unseen in Three Houses and was only mentioned a handful of times. Like I mentioned twice now, he is a womanizer, an awful ruler, suspected to have been involved in the tragedy of Duscur, which Cornelia uses to frame Dimitri for his death in Azure Moon, that he lives in Crimson Flower for the sake of keeping Dimitri's bloodline going should he die, and that in Verdant Wind, Claude says that both Rufus and Dimitri were killed, reportedly, in a bloody coup. And so he basically functioned as kind of a convenient plot device to fill in blanks such as how is the kingdom being run while Dimitri is at the academy, or is dead, or is presumed dead? But in Three Hopes, his role is greatly expanded. He was involved in the tragedy of Duscur. According to various NPCs in Chapter 3, they say, Number 1, it's a rumor in the kingdom that Rufus, whose actual role is the Duke of Itha, was responsible for King Lambert's death, and also that Rufus and Lambert had a sour relationship. And it's also at least known within Kingdom soldiers that Rufus and Dimitri don't really get along, which was the excuse Cornelia uses in Azure Moon to pin Rufus's death on him. Number 2, Dedue hates Rufus and knows that the Western Rebellion suppression, which saw Dedue, Felix, and Dimitri fight there, was another plot to kill him. But it was thanks to Rodrigue that that plan failed. And there's been even more assassination attempts within the kingdom after that. Basically, Rufus has tried and failed multiple times to have Dimitri killed. While it's all but stated by NPCs that Rufus had a role to play, the conversation in Chapter 3 between Cornelia and Rufus prove as much more explicitly.
You shouldn't have missed your chance 4 years ago in Duscur, or 2 years ago during the suppression of the rebellion. That's twice you failed to kill him.
I've learned my lesson. A lion's cub is still a lion, and one cannot slay a lion with a clumsy scheme. It's those monstrous eyes, Cornelia. They terrify me. The boy is a vicious animal, yet he attempts to feign actual grief that we can't find common ground. The aberrance of it shakes me to my core.
I understand completely.
Every night since I killed my brother, I dream a lion is ripping out my throat.
You'll run yourself ragged if you live your days in fear of revenge. You were meant to rule Faerghast, and you have the power to make it so. Your royal army is the finest in the realm, and if I may be so bold, you also have me. Put your worries to rest, my king. Sleep deeply and without fear.
Rufus takes responsibility for the fratricide and bears the weight of his failure to kill his nephew Dimitri as well. Rufus was the older of the two brothers, but since he was crestless, he would never become king. While famously known in the kingdom as a talented politician, his quote-unquote rightful place as king would never be realized so long as Lambert lived. Cornelia used Rufus's resentment to sow the seeds of the tragedy. If Rufus partook, then he does get the throne, but exploiting Rufus's feelings to get him in on the tragedy was only one step. In order for the tragedy to go off successfully, Cornelia would need buy-in from more than just the Grand Duke of Itha. Evidently, this also means that Dimitri was never meant to survive the tragedy himself, nor was he supposed to, also survive follow-up attempts on his life. It's also worth mentioning here that while Rufus claims he killed Lambert, Edelgard also explicitly tells him in Azure Gleam that Thales killed him. But both accounts are likely non-literal, since in Azure Moon, in Dimitri and Dedue's B support, Dimitri claims he saw the man who killed Lambert, but only says they were not from Duscur. Rufus wasn't even in Duscur when it happened, and Dimitri doesn't recognize Thales. Furthermore, in Crimson Flower, upon Edelgard killing Dimitri, she says that he was a victim of Lord Arundel's strategy. So it is likely when Rufus or Edelgard speak here, they're saying that they're responsible, not explicitly the ones who decapitated him, and it was probably just some hired assassin or whoever. Next question: which Western nobles were responsible? As per Margrave Gautier's interrogation of the Western lords in the battle in the kingdom,
which leads the lords Elidor, Mateus, and Kleiman. We believe they, as well as many powerful Western lords, were accomplices in the assassination of the late king. Along with the Grand Duke, they seem to have received large sums of money and supplies from the Imperial nobility. Thinking this to be recompense for the assassination in Duscur, we investigated the link further. In 1171, the mage Cornelia arranged for a certain powerful Imperial family to come to the kingdom.
The list of conspirators would extend to Gideon as well. There are other Western lords who side with them too, but are not confirmed to be conspirators involved in the murder of Lambert themselves. They may have simply allied with the Western coalition because they are neighbors, or may even share the same negative sentiments towards Lambert and Dimitri. This list includes Ro, who was rescued by Cornelia's mages from Viscount Belenus, escorting him to Ferdiad to be punished for his transgressions against the King kingdom earlier on, Duval, who is divided by east, west, and south, with the latter being able to have their rebels persuaded to switch sides, Geraint, Pryderi, and Erebus, with another possible suspect being in Enid. The reason for why they were involved goes beyond compensation from Lord Arundel. They were convinced by Cornelia. In Chapter 8, during the time when the well-intentioned Baron Dominic, whose territory is literally surrounded by conspirators, was forced to follow Cornelia's orders and join the Western Coalition, he presses Mateusz as to why they conspired to kill Lambert. They explain that they could not sit and watch as Lambert's tyrannical policies swept the kingdom. When pushed further as to why they didn't make a formal protest, he responds that it would be drowned out by his blind devotees. Basically, the western side of the kingdom treated Lambert as a radical tyrant and were convinced that Rufus and his famous political acumen was more beneficial for them as a king. It should be noted that Dimitri himself admits that the kingdom, steeped in tradition, is stubborn and not built for rapid, sweeping change. Whatever these radical changes that Lambert had were specifically, it probably had to do with social reforms that threatened the power and the way of life these Western nobles wanted to keep. Viscount Clyman had a notable role in the tragedy as well. To those uninitiated, House Clyman had no land rights of their own until after the tragedy, where they were chiefly responsible, under Rufus's command I would imagine, to oversee the annexation of Duscur and was rewarded with that territory to rule. In the paralogue Wild Flowers of the Future, Felix, Ingrid, and Dedue enter Duscur territory to deal with internal strife having to do with a Duscurian insurrection. The leader of said current insurrection aided the people who killed Lambert. In the end, they can only speculate as to why some Duscurians partook willingly in the tragedy, with Felix noting that they helped guide the conspirators around the area at the time. To summarize, Cornelia, the widely respected and trusted court mage, convinced Rufus and many of the Western nobles that killing Lambert and placing the Grand Duke was in their best interest, both politically and financially. Speaking of Cornelia, what role did Cornelia really play there? Replacing Cornelia with the Agarthan imposter Cleobulus was an important move for the Agarthans. For context, OG Cornelia was meant to get the title of court mage for curing a plague in the kingdom somewhere between 1165 and 1167, so it was vital for those who slither in the dark to have one of their agents gain this political influence. Not to mention the Cornelia identity also gave Cleobulus the means to befriend OG Cornelia's friend and King Lambert's second wife, Lady Anselma, better known as Lady Patricia, who, for political reasons, had escaped the Empire after bearing Edelgard and had been granted asylum in secret thanks to her friend. We know for a fact Cornelia was body snatched during this time frame because Three Hopes tells us that 1. Cornelia was a selfless person prior to her change, and the only request she ever made was to help give Anselma asylum.
Even used to call her a saint. What could have happened to her to make her so different?
Interestingly enough, she never asked for any kind of reward for her feat. Well, at first. In lieu of any compensation, monetary or otherwise, she requested that we rescue one of her old friends from the Empire.
And number 2, Dimitri himself asks Cleobulus the following about the tragedy.
There are 1,000 reasons why one might want to assassinate a king. But what's yours for this attempt on my life? And what of my father? Why murder him in a manner as roundabout as a staged raid? All you had to do was fail to end the plague 20 years ago, and the entire royal family would have been consumed by it.
You have a point, but I couldn't say. In a sense, that was another lifetime completely.
As for Cleobulus's direct involvement in the tragedy, besides acting as one of the Agarthans' main agents overseeing the plot, his role in bringing Lord Arundel and Edelgard in secret to Ferdinand in 1171 after the insurrection of the Seven let her trick Anselma into believing Lambert was keeping her away from her daughter on purpose, which gave her one influential accomplice who helped persuading unhappy Western Kingdom nobles into supporting the staged raid.
It wouldn't have been easy to hear all that stuff about your stepmother and the tragedy of Duscur.
Whether Cornelia's words prove true or false, any lead is worth following.
This might not be related, but I remembered something else about your stepmother. She had a daughter. Her daughter was staying in the kingdom at one point, but Anselma couldn't see her.
Her daughter? Neither my father nor I knew that the Imperial princess was in Ferdinand at the time.
Oh, that's not what I heard. I heard the king wanted to keep the child away from Anselma, so he hid the fact that their daughter was nearby.
She believed that father hid it from her? What could he have gained from such a thing?
No clue. Sorry, but I'm the wrong person to ask.
As she was seeking asylum from the Empire in the kingdom, Lord Arundel was obligated to hide the Imperial princess's whereabouts. If her location had gone public, the Empire would have demanded her return. She would undoubtedly have become a political pawn in the kingdom as well. The decision to hide her was not my father's. I did not realize until much later that the girl I'd met under such strange circumstances was my stepsister.
So then, why did Anselma think it was all your father's doing?
I can only speculate, but it seems there was a misunderstanding between her and my father. Although she was the queen consort, in truth, my father and stepmother were not even allowed the dignity of being alone together. And the one who persistently inserted herself between them was their intermediary. Your captor. It was Cornelia herself.
She hid it from Anselma.
I believe so. Meanwhile, she may have hidden my stepmother's presence from Lord Arundel as well. If Cornelia caused my stepmother to miss out on seeing them, exhorted her, used her, and then also caused the tragedy.
Oh, Dimitri. Have you read that letter from your stepmom yet?
Yes, I have. It was a missive requesting the then Viscount Elidor's cooperation in her conspiracy against my father. She claimed he would have much to gain from the king's elimination, all while shrewdly expressing sympathy with his objections to the reforms. I had it investigated for signs of forgery as a precaution, but such a search returned nothing. The letter is authentic.
Meaning your stepmom was a willing participant in the tragedy of Duscur. She sent so many to die, and would have done the same to her own stepson if all had gone according to plan.
All out of the desire to see her daughter again, or so Cornelia said. The wretch's words deserve little weight, but I believe she spoke true. I had once thought her among those I would avenge, yet now she lies squarely in the path of my fury.
Pretty heavy stuff, yeah.
Why did Thales want this to happen? The reason Thales kickstarted the tragedy is never directly stated, neither in Three Houses nor Three Hopes. However, given the former game revealed his group helped Lug's rebellion in 747 for the sake of weakening the Adrestian Empire, the Central Church's biggest ally back then, it's likely Thales wanted to weaken the kingdom of Faerghast in the present for similar reasons, as later Faerghast became the Central Church's go-to ally thanks to them recognizing their independence after defeating the Empire in 751. In fact, it's even possible that Thales, who is now confirmed to be Epimenides' comrade in arms during the War of Heroes, could have orchestrated Lug and Pan's cooperation, though that's just me speculating. This guy is very, very old is what I'm saying. By comparison's sake, the Church's influence in the Empire took a hit 100 years before the start of the story due to the Southern Church getting dismantled for getting involved in an insurrection, and the Eastern Church is, for the most part, fairly neutral and influenced by both the Central Church and the Alliance's nobility. There is also a good amount of evidence supporting this too. Both in Three Houses' Crimson Flower and in Three Hopes, the kingdom always provides shelter to Rhea and her allies after the Empire declares war and makes them flee from Garreg Mach, which Dimitri justifies in Three Hopes with the reasoning that handing Rhea over to the Empire on a silver platter would put Faerghast's independence in jeopardy. Then there's the effects the Tragedy of Duscur had politically on Faerghast for the Slitherers. Besides the tragedy handing Rufus the crown had Dimitri died as planned, Rufus is shown in Three Hopes to be Cleobulus's pawn, which comes in handy in Three Houses as it gives him the opportunity to kill him in 3 out of the 4 routes for the sake of framing Dimitri and getting rid of him, allowing Cornelia to destabilize the kingdom and facilitate Adrestia's invasion while also getting rid of a good chunk of the tragedy's evidence in the process. Finally, it's also worth remembering how much the Slitherers despise the Central Church. Not only they tried blowing it up in the past with their missiles, which didn't work due to Sothis placing a protection on the Holy Tomb, and more or less tried sabotaging it from the inside in Three Houses, Scarlet Blaze also mentions Thales openly being against the idea of rebuilding the church's southern branch regardless of motive, which explains why it was never a thing in Three Houses' timeline. What happened to Lady Patricia after the event? And is she still alive? Late Azure Moon reveals Patricia never died in the Tragedy of Duscur thanks to her cooperation in the tragedy. She was allowed to flee to Adrestia to see her daughter again, and both Three Houses and Three Hopes state it was important that no matter what, she could not die in Duscur. Meanwhile, both Cleobulus and Thales in Azure Gleam confirm that Anselma died sometime after arriving in the Empire. How and why she died, however, is the enigma. According to Cleobulus, Edelgard killed her mom soon after and knows what became of her. Not only does Edelgard have no memories of Anselma due to the latter's exile early on, plus she was being experimented on when Patricia arrived to Adrestia, when Cornelia shares this information, she also claims Lambert kept Anselma from seeing Edelgard, which isn't true in the literal sense, as Dimitri and Happy's A support shows. As a result, Cornelia's claim that Edelgard committed matricide can't be trusted at face value just yet. In stark contrast, Thales' version of Anselma's fate is far more straightforward, yet not without its ambiguity, as he tells Dimitri his stepmother burned to ashes on the pyre of our ambitions long ago, as in, he had Anselma sacrificed for his goals. Because both versions of Patricia's fate fail to make a clear picture of her last moments, the only way an answer can be obtained is through theory crafting. So it goes without saying that everything I'm about to say is not 100% confirmed and could be even proven wrong at a later date via DLC. One of the possibilities is that Thales mind-controlled Edelgard during her experiments, and she ended up killing her mother via the hijacked crest stone of the beast he uses in Azure Gleam, which would also explain why she has no memory of the events, as shown if Edelgard on this path ends up in Zaharas. This way, Cornelia can claim Edelgard did kill her own mother from a certain point of view, just like how she told Patricia that Lambert hid Edelgard from her. The catch with this theory, however, is that it raises a lot of questions about just how much Edelgard remembers of her experiments, especially if we consider her C supports with Byleth in Three Houses, and the fact both she and Hubert in Azure Moon know how to tap the power of the Hegemon Husk. The latter is important as Azure Gleam reveals it's triggered through the same stone Thales uses to brainwash her, which may or may not be the same stone used by the Emir to emulate compatibility with her crest of Seros. I guess we'll see. Did the Empire play a role in the tragedy? The final question can appear silly, given it's been made clear by now just how deep the Agarthans were involved in the tragedy. However, it's important to note that from an outsider's perspective, it's easy to jump onto the conclusion that the Empire did in fact start the Tragedy of Duscur, which is what actually happens in Three Houses as far as Dimitri's concerned.
I always suspected that Lord Arundel was behind the tragedy 9 years ago. The timing of his departure from the kingdom, the fact that he abruptly stopped making donations, too many factors made him suspect. If Lord Arundel conspired with Cornelia, then what Kronya and the others said 5 years ago?
In Azure Moon, if you ignore the hints from both Cornelia and Arundel are in truth Agarthan, we didn't know her true identity was Cleobulus originally, and Thales in disguise, the picture provided of the incident is that one day, both persons had a change of heart, conspired together along with Lady Patricia and some kingdom nobles to kill the king of Faerghast, and framed all of Duscur for it. And if you don't pair up Dimitri with Happy, it remains at that. By stark contrast, Azure Gleam makes it blatantly clear that the Agarthans in reality impersonated two important Adrestians and used their resources and connections to destabilize Faerghast, all while keeping the true culprit's involvement hidden from public knowledge. And that's all we know so far. If there is DLC for the game, there should be eventually, it's up in the air whether or not questions about Thales or Anselma will be further clarified. But to be honest, who knows with this game? You can never predict what the writers want to elaborate on, or what they want to cut corners on, or what they just completely want to ignore. And that will do it for this analysis. This is off-script gas now. This was a pretty interesting script to write about, especially because the Tragedy of Duscur was such an enigma in the original game that we had to like theory craft for things to tie together. And who would have thought that Three Hopes would be a thing and answer a bunch of questions that we had, and would end up kind of reimagining and retconning a few characters along the way. The Three Hopes lore arc of the channel is just starting now, and I'm really excited to really dig into the lore and the documents of this game to provide some new cool videos about just what Fodlan is all about and what kind of character arcs that these old and new characters go through. It's going to be a really exciting time for the channel, I'd bet. So if you are interested and you did like this video and you want to see more Three Hopes coverage like this in the future, this is kind of like, I don't know, my favorite kind of thing to talk about and kind of like the bread and butter of the channel these days. The channel just hit 97,000 subscribers and is climbing its way slowly but surely to the very close now, I guess, 100,000 subscriber goals. So if you do want to support the channel, it would really mean a lot. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the Tragedy of Duscur. Obviously, I can't really help spoilers at this point because we are getting into spoiler territory. If you didn't finish like every route, just like I'm not going to take the blame for that. That's your call. And with that all being said, thank you all so much for tuning in and watching. And next video is going to be about Arval. So that should be really fun as well. Anyways, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Deuces.
You